Okay, thank you very much first for the invitation and the opportunity to be here and to see old and good friends. Now, my starting point is actually very similar to Marion's. That is not a surprise. The starting point being that I tend to look at globalization as a very positive phenomenon. But obviously, I think we understand that there are not just gains from trade, gains from globalization, there are also pains from trade and from globalization. I think one has to obviously see, as you said, Marion, I mean, when we look at, for instance, Eurobarometer surveys of citizens in Europe, we see that many people are fearful of globalization. They see indeed, as you said, I fully agree, they see indeed that globalization is bringing a number of good things, but they're also very fearful, and in particular, typically, the fear is about jobs. Right? This is certainly number one on the agenda of Europeans, jobs, and globalization is not viewed very often by citizens as being very helpful for them and for their jobs. So I think that has got to be the starting point. The other starting point that you put forward, and which I think I very much agree, is what is the nature of globalization today? I mean, in a sense, we know that, and we have some economic historians here, we know that this is not the first wave of globalization. There was an important wave of globalization before this one, and this is a wave of globalization that ended a century ago with the start of First World War. So I think we know that globalization can certainly run into big problems. And I think we should not take globalization as something given, that what we have seen in the last 20 years will continue for the next 100 years. No. I think that indeed the fact that there are lots of people unhappy about globalization, it brings about a number of major changes, both within countries and between countries, bears the fruits of possible almost destruction of globalization. And I think one has to have one's eyes open. So, yes, there are benefits, but there are also a number of costs because of the conflicts that arise out of globalization. And I think the point on which I very much agree with Marion is that, a century ago, the first wave of globalization that had started in the middle or second half of the 19th century and ended with First World War was very different in one dimension, in one respect, from the current phase of globalization. The first phase of globalization is what some would have called the imperialist phase of globalization. Right? We, the North, and some of us imperial countries, we were at the center of the process of globalization. And today, when we look at globalization, what we associate globalization with, that's what Marion said, with China, with India, with the emerging countries. And we feel a bit on the defensive. And it's true that, if you look at the numbers coming from the IMF, if you look at the world GDP measured, not at in current dollars or current euros, but in purchasing power parities, then already 3-4 years ago, the advanced economies have lost their primacy. We all together, all the OECD countries, let's say, we don't anymore produce 50% of world GDP. We are on a relative decline. We are still very rich, and we are still much richer than emerging and developing countries, but in relative terms, we are losing out. And indeed, especially in manufacturing, you see it much there, right? Where is manufacturing growth taking place? Lots of those, what is the factory of the world today? China. Or Asia is the factory of the world. So it's clear that when we are thinking of globalization, we are seeing this global changes taking place, and we don't feel that we are at the center, we are the main beneficiaries. we feel that the main beneficiaries are the others. And there's a little bit of this West versus the rest discussion. So I would say that globalization today, lots of positive elements, but I think there are two types of conflicts that it brings that are in a sense similar to the type of conflicts that ended the first phase of globalization. One is about income distribution. It's not by chance that the book of Thomas Piketty was so successful. It rings a bell to many citizens, not just in the US, but also in Europe, that income distribution has been worsening. We had, when we were younger, right, we had a nice phase after the war, income distribution was improving. But now, we know for the last 20 years, there is a worsening of income distribution and of wealth distribution. So there are internal conflicts in our societies. But there are also, indeed, those conflicts between countries, between the relatively declining advanced economies, still very rich and still, producing lots of nice income, but relatively declining, and then the emerging countries, what some people are referring to as the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China. But then there are other emerging countries that are out there. There are the Indonesias, there are Mexico's, indeed Turkey, others are also large and important economies. And in a sense, if you look at the first wave of globalization, that's really why it ended. Conflict between emerging countries and the imperial countries. The emerging countries then, Germany was an emerging country, and the other emerging countries of that time was Japan, that were sort of trying to knock the door of those imperial power. Russia, France, the UK obviously, but Italy was also there, my country, Belgium was also, we were sort of the colonial powers. And so those countries were trying to come in and had difficulties. And then there was this incredible increase in the inequalities linked to also the Industrial Revolution. Today we have another kind of technological revolution. So we are very much in the same sort of situation, technological change, global changes, and huge tensions. Now, how did we handle this situation after World War II? Let's pass, from First World War to the horrible years between the two world wars and the even more horrible years of the Second World War. And then a number of people, wise people, more wise than even those on the panel here, from the ashes of Second World War, or in the middle of the Second World War, they realized that one needs to do certain things, both internally and internationally. Internationally was sort of global governance. The Bretton Woods institutions, the GATT institution, sort of trying to tame the beast, trying to put forward multilateral institutions for countries to deal with conflicts that arise inevitably. But let's try to deal with those conflicts, those economic conflicts that arise in a multilateral manner and inside, not sort of just power politics, but having some kind of institutional approach. But in our societies also we dealt with that, with the welfare state. Right? The welfare state was really created during the war. We knew that, we were all fighting against the enemies, all forces, all social forces, but therefore we needed after the war to have an equal distribution of income. In order to fight together, we were to be assured that we were not going to recreate the same order that we had before, the same kind of social order. We needed an agreement of a new social order that will be in place after the fight and after we would have defeated the enemies that had created those elements. Now, I think the system that we put in place, the welfare state and global governance, they worked very well. And they worked very well, and indeed they are the one that allowed, in a sense, globalization to take place. Globalization came against the background of those institutions, the global institutions and the national institution, the national sort of social welfare institutions. Now, if you're asking me today, am I optimistic about the future of globalization by examining the state of those institutions? My answer is yes and no. Now, let's start with the internal institutions, with welfare, the welfare state. And let's go back a second to the Eurobarometer that I mentioned before, asking European citizens, how do they consider globalization? Is globalization an opportunity, or is globalization a threat? And if you ask that to European citizens, you see that European citizens are very divided, but by country. They're also very divided within country according to their level of education and their age. Typically, less well-educated persons are much more fearful because they feel indeed competition from unskilled workers from developing countries. And if they're older, they're also more fearful of change in general. The younger ones, more educated, they are very positive towards globalization. But it's not just those characteristics, or the individual characteristics. It depends also in which countries people are. If you're in Italy, if you're in France, if you're in Greece, the overwhelming majority is fearful of globalization. If you're in Sweden, if you're in Finland, if you're in Denmark, the overwhelming majority is positive, sees the opportunities. So clearly there is a link between the kind of social system you have, and I can see that those systems where there is, let's say, what I would call flexi-security. That is, you have systems that are allowing changes to take place, because indeed we are, that's what Marion, you explained, right? We are in a period of very, very fast change. And one needs societies that can adapt to this change, but can do it also with solidarity. So one needs the flexibility, one needs the security of the solidarity. And some countries have managed to put in place those systems. No, this is not something that is going to come from Brussels or from anywhere. That is to come from within the society, to make those reforms of the social system that then allow also the economic system to operate for the 21st century and for the challenge of the 21st century, which is going to be more globalization, not less. So I think this is one issue. But then the second issue is about the global governance. Now, global governance, we had the GATT created in 1947. In 1995, the GATT became the WTO, was expanded in the World Trade Organization. And you know, what should we say about the state of the GATT WTO? Is that an element of global governance which is strong, that can resist to the tensions, or is it a weak body, a weak institution? Well, there I'm very divided in a sense. Because yes, it's very easy to say, you know, the WTO is dead, and look at the Doha round of negotiations that were launched in 2001. Well, one doesn't see the end in sight, you know. They'll never come to an agreement. There is no 161 members in the WTO. It's a very unruly organization. China has become member in 2001. Russia has become member. There's so much diversity of members. There are so many members to begin with. They can't agree. Okay, they just can't agree. And the proof that they can't agree is that, indeed, you know, we still, 15 years after the launch of this negotiation, we don't have a result, even a minimum result. And I think that's true. One can look at it in this way. Another way to look at it is that the world economy was subject to a huge shock in 2009. Maybe not the Great Depression, but certainly the Great Recession, where world GDP fell, when global trade it grew at a negative rate, major change, and yet, if my friend Simon will agree, I will say, despite what some say, I would say that the rise of protectionism that came was almost zero. And especially if you compare it to what happened on the side of GDP, and also this element of redistribution of world income. If you look at the fact that world trade collapsed, that the growth of the emerging countries has continued, has even accelerated since the crisis, you would say there must have been a huge increase of protectionism vis-à-vis the Chinas and the other emerging countries in the advanced economies. And yes, in Europe, if you look at anti-dumping cases, more than half of the anti-dumping cases are against China. That's clear. But has there been an increase of anti-dumping cases? The answer is no. So there's nothing commensurate to the fact that there was this huge shock, both long-term shock with the changes of relative powers of the advanced and the emerging countries, and the fact that the advanced economies are the ones that were hit most by the crisis. I did not see much increase of protection. You know, I will yield to the fact that there was an increase of protection, but I would say it was minimal. And I would say it was thanks to the fact that indeed the system has worked well. If I look at this global governance as an insurance system, so we have social welfare as a collective insurance within our societies, but also the WTO as a collective insurance at the global level, I would say this global insurance, at the time of very big tension, the system has worked well. So I'm of a mixed view. Nonetheless, it's clear that countries behave as if the WTO, apart from the protection, they behave as WTO in Geneva is not anymore the place where we really deal with trade. And what we have seen certainly in the last 30 years is a huge increase in the regional trade agreements. In 1990, there were only 30 regional trade agreements. By 2001, at the time of the launch of the Doha round and the entry of China in the WTO, there were 100 regional trade agreements. Today, according to the WTO, there are 262 trade agreements, regional trade agreements, and every of the 161 members of the WTO is a party to at least one regional trade agreement. Some are parties to 10, 20, including the EU. Now, what is even more, I think, in a sense, worrisome is that we are not talking anymore today just of regional trade agreements. People are talking about these mega regional trade agreements. And the mega regional trade agreements is not just between sometimes large countries like the EU and the US and small countries or between small countries, but it's between the big elephants. One of them is TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Another one which is currently being negotiated is between the US and some of the Pacific and Asian countries, including Japan. The EU is also engaged in negotiation with Japan. And among the Asian countries, Japan, Korea, China, the ASEAN economies are also engaged into one of those mega regional trade agreements. And you know, the way I was educated is to think that, you know, regional trade agreements, yes, they bring trade liberalization, but they also bring fragmentation of the system. They bring preferences. You can call it preferences on the one hand, but you can call them discrimination. And I would say that mega regionals, they risk bringing mega discrimination. So I'm personally a bit worried of this development and the fact that countries are indeed losing interest for the WTO and are pursuing this regional trade agreement, sort of these bilateral deals, including the EU and the US, that were both really the founding countries of both the GATT and the WTO. So let me just take 2 minutes and say something about TTIP besides what I just said. So I expressed already a bit of my skepticism about the benefit of TTIP and the benefit in general of those kind of agreements that are implying that countries are losing their interest in the multilateral trading system. And that worries me. That worries me precisely because the way we are going to be able to deal with these global changes with the emerging countries, the Chinas, the Indias, the Brazils, that are going to take more and more space. We want to have a global system and with global rules to deal with this globalization. But let me also express my view that I have some skepticism about TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Agreement, on a different ground. The agreement is viewed, the free trade agreement, free trade and free investment is viewed and has been put forward as having big impact on growth, on employment, and that's what we need. I mean, we have low growth, we have high unemployment, and if you are being offered an agreement that would deliver growth and employment, that sounds great. What the hell this guy was talking about, the multilateral trading system in 1947 and all the blah, blah, blah. It's good to take those benefits that it may produce. And yet we see that there seem to be lots of people marching in the street about TTIP, even more than about the WTO. Nobody's protesting about the WTO these days, but they're protesting about TTIP. Now, why is that? Now, I would say that, number one, too much has been promised of what TTIP will deliver in terms of growth and employment. If you look at the studies, including the CEPR study, which I think was a very, very nice study, the results are there more modest. Okay, it produces, yes, I mean, we all believe that removing barriers to trade will improve the allocation of resources and will create some growth, but I think the numbers are much less. But what is interesting to say is that labor unions seem to be opposed to the agreement. So why are labor unions opposed to something that would create growth and employment? Why is that? Are those guys crazy? Now, when you ask them why they are opposed often to this, it's not because they are fearing that TTIP is going to create unemployment. And I don't think that any of us trade economists believes that more trade between the EU and the US, countries that are more or less at the same level of development, is going to increase greatly the reallocation of resources between the EU and the US and lead to dislocation, as it may between Europe and China, okay, or between Europe and India, or Europe and developing countries, because we are very different. Between the EU and the US, we are very similar, and we don't expect that the kind of trade is the one that will produce this major dislocation. So I don't think that people are worried on the labor side, the fact that TTIP maybe will not create much job or will destroy a lot of jobs. No, they are worried about something else, which is what, in a sense, TTIP is about mostly, and that's its innovation. It's about regulation. Now, it's about regulation, and there one does hear people, rightly or wrongly, sometimes, in my view, rightly, sometimes actually wrongly. I think there's a lot of things that are being said that are totally unreasonable on both sides of the aisle. But the view is that indeed what will happen, and that's what the opponents fear, is that TTIP will limit the ability of state to regulate. And in particular in the labor area. It will, since in Europe we have more advanced social norms and social rules than in the US, the fear is that we are going to have to roll back some of our social norms. So it's not, I'm going to lose my job, but I'm going to have a job with less protection. This is what people are fearing. So this is why labor unions are opposed. Now, I don't think that actually one is going to have, in a major manner, this kind of effect. But it's true that the way, at least initially, this negotiation has started, including on this investment discussion, this famous ISDS that we could come back in the discussion, this investor-state dispute settlement that seemed to be giving to large corporations certain rights or certain way to look at regulation and say, hey, wait a second, you are putting regulation here that may be detrimental to my profit, including regulation on environment, on health, and on labor. That seems to limit the scope, the ability of governments to regulate, because some large corporations would complain about that, and states may hesitate. And I think this is an issue. This is not, I think, an issue which is being addressed rightly by the Commission and good in a multilateral manner. I think this is the solution. But I just want to finish by saying this. I think those who hope or fear that TTIP would create a transatlantic single market, I think those people are wrong. TTIP will not create this transatlantic single market. And I think it will not do so for 3 reasons. Number one, on regulation, we have too much difference of philosophy of regulation between Europe and the United States. I mean, think of the precautionary principle, something that Americans regard again, rightly or wrongly, as crazy. You know, this is sort of Europeans who have this precautionary principle. Before we put something, you know, we have to be sure of all the possible consequences. This is not the way the Americans operate. Second, and I think the most important, is politics. Behind the European single market and behind the ability to decide on regulation at the European level, there needed to be some political legitimacy. And that political legitimacy comes, in part, from a European Parliament. No, we are not about to create a transatlantic parliament. We are not about to create, in a sense, the transatlantic institutions of the sort that we have in Europe. One can view that the European institutions are too weak and not enough democratic. But then think of the kind of mechanism we have on a transatlantic setting. We are just not going to go in that direction. We are not about to create this transatlantic political system that could underpin the regulation. And the third reason is bureaucratic. Behind regulation stand bureaucracies, agencies. And when you are putting those different agencies, the American agencies and the European agencies around the table, and you try to negotiate between themselves, I wish you good luck. Let me stop here.
Thank you.